Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Bey, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 103rd episode. In the past year or so, I've spent quite a bit of time reading up on the science of climate change, the tech to deal with it, and the critically important issue of climate finance. I've done a bit of writing on that as well, and recently I've done quite a bit of collaboration with our guest today. Helge Muenkel is the Chief Sustainability Officer at DBS. He is responsible for developing the bank's overarching sustainability framework. He also chairs the Group Sustainability Council, which comprises of senior DBS leaders across business and support units. Helge represents DBS in several global and regional working groups, such as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the Industry Advisory Panel of the ASEAN's Joint Sustainable Financing Working Group, and the MAS-convened Green Finance Industry Task Force. So quite a few hats you wear, Helge. Welcome to Kopi Time.
Thanks a lot for having me, Taimur. Much appreciated.
I've been looking forward to this conversation, and we have a lot to cover, Helge. Let's start by setting the basic foundation. Let's talk about the current state of climate finance. What kind of money is needed to make meaningful change in this green transition?
Absolutely. Let's do that. Before I jump into climate finance, one, setting the scene point around this, what do we need it for? So if we just consider that climate change is ultimately driven by accumulated greenhouse gas emissions that we put up into the atmosphere, and we've done quite a lot of that in the past. Looking forward, we have another roughly 400 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions that we can put in the atmosphere until we hit this famous 1.5 C scenario. So global temperatures will rise by 1.5 C as compared to pre-industrial levels. And that's quite significant. It's not just a technical number, it actually has real-world impacts. So 400 gigatons roughly we have left until we get there. If we don't change the way we play, live, and work today, we are roughly emitting 50 gigatons or thereabouts per annum. So simple math, we have around 8 years or so left until we hit that famous 1.5 C limit. And again, this 1.5 C, it's not just a technical number. It has a real impact on the communities, especially here in Asia. So that simply means we have a lot to do in a very, very short time frame. So ultimately, you can consider this, we did another industrial revolution, only this time at the speed of the digital transformation. So we need to completely rewire the way we organize our life, rewire the way we organize our economies, lightning quickly. So action matters, and it matters at scale and at speed. So what do we now need in order to finance that stuff really, really quickly? There are all sorts of different studies out there from think tanks, science and industry groups. But if I simplify this a little bit, then one study tells us we need roughly 9 trillion USD per annum to invest in our energy systems and land use systems per annum, per year, between now and 2050. The 9 trillion you can break down. So a certain amount of money we already spent today. We spend a certain amount of money on existing energy infrastructure, which also, by the way, includes fossil fuels because we can't switch them off tonight. And also already existing investments in clean tech. But we need an additional, so out of the total of 9, we did an additional 3.5 trillion to invest in our energy systems and land use systems. So these numbers are quite staggering.
So 3.5 trillion is like India's GDP.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? If you break it down into GDP numbers per annum, then for a country like India, we would need roughly a little bit more than 10% of GDP per annum to invest in the existing energy infrastructure, a little bit in the old, also fossil fuel infrastructure, but mainly, of course, into the new one. In other countries of Asia, it might be around 9% of GDP. In China, it's a bit less. It's only 5%. But the numbers are staggering. So we need a lot of money at a very, very within a very short period of time.
Big numbers. So are we generating that money? Is serious money being deployed? Where do we see the most momentum?
Yeah.
And more importantly, where's the money coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer is yes, but. And I'm going to give you a very simple number at the end. But let me maybe first highlight a couple of challenges. So what prevents us from accelerating the allocation of capital to the extent we need to? And there are a couple of those challenges. Number one is policy certainty. So if you want private sector to unlock CapEx, to put money on the table to build new infrastructure, and if you want private capital providers to finance that, you want to know what is the direction of travel. So here government can play a really, really critical role, not only setting out net zero 2050 targets, but going much, much deeper. How do we actually want to accomplish this? Singapore does this actually very, very well. We have created industry roundtables where we all come together in one room and discussing how are we decarbonizing Singapore. But we need to see much more of that on global scale to create policy certainty. And for example, in Europe, they have decided on a stick: regulation, including a carbon price. In the US, different approach. They used a carrot, one of the biggest checks in corporate history, where they said we have now this Inflation Reduction Act where they support the investments in clean tech and so on and so forth. In Asia, we don't yet have this on a macro scale as such. So we need more of that. The second key challenge is we actually, spoiler alert, don't have a lack of capital. I actually think we have enough capital in the system from private and public sector combined. The problem very often is that the risk return profiles of these new products or new projects that we need to do are a bit challenging for providers of private capital like ourselves. We do a lot, but we could do even more. And there are some solutions that I'm going to talk about maybe in a bit. A third challenge is trade-off decisions, especially in Asia. We need to be mindful that we not only need to tackle the climate crisis, but there are billions of people we need to take care of as well. We need to have socioeconomic development. We need jobs and all these types of things. And they are interconnected issues. We need to be quite mindful around that agenda. And then another one is simply capacity building. Sometimes we sit in a banking room and we look at PowerPoint slides and we know all the numbers, but we still need people to actually do it. We need a plumber. We need an engineer. We need a mechanic to repair an EV. We need bankers and all this. So capacity building is a key issue as well. So if I draw a line, there are all these challenges and we tackle some of them quite well, some of them maybe not yet well. But if I look at numbers, it was a yes, but answer, right, that I started with. So last year, it already was very clear that we're investing more and more in renewable energy. For 2023, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, expects that we invest roughly $1.7 trillion in clean tech. And we invest roughly $1 trillion in fossil fuels. So that's a total of $2.7 trillion. Remember my $9 trillion at the start?
That's right, yep.
The positive news is this number is going up and you see a tilt in the ratio. So a number of years back, for every dollar we spend in fossil fuels, we spend roughly $1 on clean tech. Now, for 2023, the IEA expects we spend $1 on fossil fuels and $1.7 for renewables and clean tech more broadly. That's great news. We just need to get this up probably to 1 to 4. So for every $1 on fossil fuel, we probably need $4 in clean tech. So this is my yes, but answer. So money is flowing, not yet at the scale we need and not at the ratio we need, but we are slowly seeing momentum.
Would it be safe to say that most of the funding has to come from the private sector?
I think if you look at the numbers that I mentioned at the beginning, the volumes are staggering.
Yeah.
Right. So in my humble view, the answer is yes, also, but we need very often public money as a catalyst. Mm-hmm. So we call this, for example, blended finance transactions. So let's say there's a renewable energy project in a country somewhere in Southeast Asia. And maybe the risk return profiles, for a variety of reasons, is not really conducive to us. So can we create a blended finance structure where you get a bit of public money in, for example, as a first loss piece or as an equity piece or whatever, to ultimately crowd in private capital. And depending on what leverage ratio, so for $1 of public money, how much bucks of private capital do you get? You then ultimately get to the solution. So I think it's a combination, but the majority will have to come from private sector, yes.
I think these sort of first loss protections can be very useful. I've seen this not just on the E part of the ESG side, but on the S and the G side as well. Yeah. So like gender-related funding, a lot of times you get an aid agency from Australia or Europe or the US come up with the first tranche protection, and that sort of galvanizes other investors to come in. So of course, it makes total sense that it'll happen on the climate change side as well. You mentioned the phrase blended finance. So let's break that down a little bit. There are all sorts of ways to fund a project. So I'm sure there are all sorts of ways to fund a climate transition project as well. So we've got bonds and blended finance and grants, carbon credits. Give us a sense of, which one is big these days, which one is catching momentum, and what they are actually.
Absolutely. Let me maybe describe two broad categories.
Sure.
One category is what are the activities and assets we're financing, and the second one is what are the instruments we're using to do so. So on the first one, what are the assets and activities? Let me be a bit simplistic. So if you look at everything that needs to be financed, it's almost like a traffic light system. So there is the dark green stuff. Think of electricity generation by renewable energy. We all know it's clean. We all know we need to do much, much more of that. On the other side, the red traffic light, let's call it dark, dark brown. Think of electricity generation by power. It's really, really dirty. And no matter how much effort you put in, there's never going to be a commercial viable solution to make it clean or cleaner. So we don't want to do it. So the only question is, when do we stop doing it? But there's this gigantic pile in the middle, the amber part of the traffic light, which we call transition. So it's stuff that is potentially brown, light brown, or whatever the shade of brown might be, but with the right efforts and the right technology, you can make it ultimately clean. Now, having this traffic light on our minds, the world has come together and we have broadly agreed on what is this dark green stuff and what is this brown, dark brown stuff. So we're good on that. So money is flowing there and we're flowing into the green stuff, and we see money flowing out of the dark brown. The issue in the middle is that we have not yet come together as a global planet and agreed upon what is a credible transition, what is a credible transition activity, and so on and so forth. Work is being done, so it's not that nothing has been done, but there's no global agreement. And we really need to unlock this, because more than 90% of our economic activities today are in this orange bucket. So if we don't tackle this, we're not going to save us on this planet. So that's one area of looking at it. This transition is really a key focus area. And then looking at the various instruments. I mean, there are use of proceeds instruments where I give you money and you can only use that money for a specific purpose, like you're financing a green building or you're financing an electric vehicle and so on and so forth. There are other instruments which we call sustainability linked. I give you money and you can use it for whatever you want to do. It's a general corporate purposes facility, for example. However, the interest rate on this financing is not fixed. So depending on your performance versus pre-agreed sustainability KPIs, the interest rate might go up and down. And there are many, many other types of financing. There are, of course, loans, there are bonds, there are trade facilities, there are carbon credits, which we also think is a very important tool in the toolkit to unlock capital, and so on and so forth. So there's actually a wide variety of instruments that we can deploy. You mentioned blended finance, and why is blended finance so important? I mentioned at the start, one of the key challenges we have is the risk-return profile of certain projects. So we are a fairly sizable bank here in the Asia-Pacific region, and we're financing a lot. More than half or around half of our power portfolio is already in renewable energy. But also we sometimes face situations where we struggle with the risk-return. So blended finance is, in simple terms, you have a bucket of public money and you have a bucket of private money, put it together, and ultimately by combining it, the weighted average cost of capital comes down and you attract private capital by virtue of having the public money in there. It's a very, very important way of unlocking more capital flows. It's, by the way, a product that we've known for decades. So many of these instruments actually are not new. Blended finance, for sure not.
Right.
So the only question is, if you go back to the very start of our conversation, 8 years left until we hit the 1.5C, how can we scale it at speed? That is really the key question. So we have all of those. So for example, in blended finance, it's really all about, can we agree on a certain template? And then we do it again and again and again. And we're not renegotiating and starting with Adam and Eve, but really doing it on the base of a template. I know it's a bit simplistic because every country is different, every asset is different, but we need to really scale blended finance to unlock the capital we need.
Helge, if I think about this issue from the private sector's perspective, of course, the fact that whether it is measurement of KPIs or even the measurement of the environmental degradation that is happening, private sector is still not fully on board with it, taxonomy and metrics, different jurisdictions, different things. So they want some degree of handholding from the public sector. To your point, you can lower the cost of funding of a project by putting some public money in the bucket. But if I look at it from the public sector's perspective, it would be like, well, Econ 101 tells me that I just need to get the pricing right. So I will just do heavy carbon taxing and the private sector can figure things out. Why hasn't that approach worked? Is it because we don't have a very good way to trade carbon yet? Or there are other rigidities that I have not thought through, but maybe you can help us understand?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look at the entire world, a bit more than 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions are now subjected to a carbon price. that can be either in the form of a tax, like here in Singapore we have a carbon tax, or what we call a cap and trade scheme like we have in the European Union. We have these instruments in China. We have it in certain states in the US, for example, in California, but we don't have it on federal level in the US. So around 80% plus or minus are not covered by a carbon tax. So the question is very valid and a really good one. The only answer I have is it's probably a political will situation, because coming back, especially in Asia Pacific, talking about the just transition, the interconnectedness of issues, how hostile situations can become, I can only assume it's politically sometimes really, really difficult to implement these measures, given the implications it has.
Right. And I think, not necessarily, I'm keen on defending the profession of economics too much. So ideally, yes, a price on carbon should be able to internalize a lot of the externalities. But in real life, whether it is a political issue that you talk about, or just a matter of, sort of measuring the impact and putting the right price, not that straightforward, as we have seen with carbon exchanges around the world, including European Union's experience and China's experience with putting a tax on carbon. You just mentioned the phrase just transition.
Yeah.
To unpack that, because it's become a bit of a loaded phrase. During the COP meetings, we hear a lot about it, particularly from developing countries. There's some degree of impatience. I'll give you one example. I was in Indonesia recently, and it seemed to me it was very clear that the government or the government officials there who were at that meeting basically expected a lot of grant money from the West, because they feel that's the just thing for the West to do. Having polluted the world, now they're putting all this pressure on developing countries. So break down the just transition concept for us a bit.
So in simple terms, it's not only about climate. We have 17 United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. That's a bit the North Star of how we look at sustainability. So what does it mean? It means we probably have around 9 billion people by 2050, thereabouts. So sustainability would mean that these 9 billion people can live well. Now, what does live well mean? It means you have food on the plate. It means you have access to fresh water and fresh air. It means you have access to medical services, you have shelter, and all these types of things. But secondly, we also need to assure that the way we do this is within planetary boundaries, so that the people that are very young today or not even yet born can also live well. So this is this intergenerational fairness, which humans, in my humble view, have always struggled with in history. So humans have been extraordinary in the things we've done, but very often intergenerationally unfair. So sustainability, bringing it back, means that 9 billion people plus live well with all the things I mentioned, but we also do it in a way that future generations can live well. That, to me, is a simple concept of sustainability. So if you take an action, for example, on climate, you need to be mindful of the implications it might have on the other sustainability goals. So that's a simple fact around the just transition. And I think one thing that's not often talked about is this intergenerational fairness thing. So you're not only doing it today, but you're actually doing it for good. So that's, to me, the simple way of looking at it.
Sure. So this thing that we see, all these activists basically saying that, the US and Europe have polluted the world for a century. China began only 20, 30 years ago. India is about to join the party. How can we tell these countries to stop following the growth paradigm that their Western counterparts did? Where is the justice in that? Because we also want to live well, to your point, that within 10, 20, 30 years, we want to achieve all the SDGs. So from your perspective, this ethical question, that what is the burden for a developing country which is not responsible for pollution, but still needs to do its share of adjustment?
Let me put first some facts around your statement around historical contributions, because there are numbers to this. So science tells us, and when I say science, I refer to the IPCC report. So every 7 or so years, a huge number of scientists comes together and writes ultimately reports on the state of climate. And in the most recent iteration in 2022, there was a report again being published, and on page 10 of the third working paper, you will find a graph that tells you that globally, historically accumulated greenhouse gas emissions, 39% of these arose from Europe and North America. So roughly 40% of all the greenhouse gas emissions that are already up there originate from these two regions. that is the historical responsibility that we're always talking about. And actually, even still today, if you calculate greenhouse gas emissions on a per capita basis, then still Europe today is much dirtier than various parts of Asia, which, by the way, is not too surprising because, of course, you see that more developed nations typically have higher greenhouse gas emissions as of
more
today.
economic activity, more emission. Yeah,
exactly, right? So that's just, I wanted just to give you a fact around these historical obligations. Now, looking forward, ultimately it doesn't matter, right? A ton of carbon is a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon.
We're all affected.
We have 400 gigatons left. So finger pointing doesn't really help us anyhow. So we need to really come to a solution together. But I think what it means is that, of course, in Asia, you see a lot of population growth. You see an amazing GDP growth. So in terms of future sources of emissions, it's very clear we're probably going to account for more than half global greenhouse gas emissions very, very soon. So taking these two things into account, historical responsibility, but also how the future will look like, I think we simply need some help from developed nations, acknowledging the fact of what happened in the past, which science tells us, is a matter of fact. So what I would see is the developed nations providing know-how and capital for developing nations to accomplish this just transition. And one template that I really like is this Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP. So it arose at COP26 in Scotland, and the basic idea is that G7 countries provide money to a developing nation for empowering that developing nation to transition to a lower carbon society. It started with South Africa. Now we're discussing it with Indonesia and Vietnam, both of which is in our backyard, and maybe India is the next one. So again, the basic idea is G7 provides capital and hopefully know-how, and these countries are better equipped to transition, giving them also some breathing space to buffer the implications on, for example, certain social dimensions that we discussed, right? For example, certain jobs. Because let's not forget, in this transition to a low-carbon society, there are going to be winners and losers. Yeah, if I break it down, if you are a 50-year-old engineer at a coal power plant, it is very unlikely that you overnight become a solar PV engineer or a mechanic that can repair electric vehicles. So it is simply a fact. So we need to make conscious choices. How can we support them? How can we take them along? So by way of having these templates, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, JETP, I think I got the name wrong at the start, you actually have a nice template on how we could actually move forward to accomplish this, maybe just transition.
One clarification on JETP is we're talking about debt capital or grants?
It can take different forms.
I see.
But ultimately, it's a certain pool of capital that is provided to really facilitate the transition. It's not really defining the instrument as such.
Right. I've seen, for example, the IMF now has a climate change trust fund,
Yeah.
and a few countries around the world have taken in that money. It's still debt capital, but extremely low interest rate with a very long amortization period, so
Yeah.
almost free money, if you will.
Yeah.
So the key question around climate finance is the biggest source of finance in the world, which are banks.
Yeah.
And you and I work in one of those. Tell us about what banks have been doing the last decade or so and how optimistic or energized you are by banks' role in just transition and climate transition.
Absolutely. Let's first maybe establish that we really need ecosystem change. And what I mean by that is that all of us need to come together. It's government, it's regulators, it's the real world players like the private sector companies, the finance sector, and all of us embedded in the community at large. We really all need to come together. Why? We have these 8 years left, right? So no one of us in this ecosystem can do it alone. So everyone has a distinct role to play. And banks, I would say, have at least two critical roles. One is simple. The simple in theory is the reallocation of capital. So you reallocate capital away from polluting activities towards low carbon activities. That's one thing. The other one is really innovation. We can also foster innovation. It's not only technological innovation in the field of renewable energy or energy efficiency or the production of steel or the production of cement. We can also be innovative. How can we be innovative? For example, with regards to financing structures, we mentioned blended finance, where we can actually really tweak it here and there to make it work, to really scale it at speed. We can be innovative in finding digital solutions to empower our retail customers to be more aware around sustainability and to also take conscious choices, which in aggregate can have an impact. We also always think beyond our client base. So, for example, we are a proud founding shareholder of Climate Impact X, CIX, which is a Singapore headquartered but global carbon market and exchange, which has set up platforms that facilitate the buying and selling of high quality, integrity carbon credits. So there are a lot of things we can do in the field of innovation ourselves. So capital, innovation, both very, very critical, and it needs to work in tandem with the other ecosystem partners. And I very loosely mentioned earlier that Singapore is doing this very well. So if I double click on that in Singapore, the Prime Minister's office in Singapore, in coordination with other regulators, for example, the MAS, which is our financial regulator, convenes and brings people together in a room, government, regulator, private sector, finance sector, to really discuss how are we going to do this, because this interplay of these players is really very important. Now, granted, Singapore is a bit smaller, and maybe the political situation in Europe and in the US is a little bit more complex, I understand, but it's actually a really interesting template on how you could do it. Just get everyone in the ecosystem into a room.
Putting politics aside, I mean, I'm being told by my colleagues in the US that regardless of what happens in Washington, D.C., by and large, US banks, US corporate sectors are moving in a single direction toward green transition, toward climate finance, and that is not going to change regardless of the political cycle. Are they being too optimistic?
I hope not, is the answer. So I hope the train left the station. And why do I think the train has left the station? Let's first look at a couple of numbers. Right now, we have more than 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions covered by nation states as net zero pledges. So we now have 140 plus countries that have net zero pledges by a certain time frame. Are they perfect? No, but we are really getting there. We have in the private sector now more than 5,000 corporates that have either already implemented or committed to implement science-based decarbonization targets. Around 25% of that, by the way, sits in Asia. Right. And then if you look at the finance sector, we have, for example, GFANs, which is a collection of financial institutions from different areas, so insurance companies, pension funds, banks, asset managers, asset owners, etc., PP, that in totality right now have an AUM of around 150 trillion US dollars. So government, private sector, finance sector, everything is moving. Look at the community at large. When I was very young, I didn't have gray hair back then. In Germany, we were all, huddling in the lower ground. We were all young teenagers, and we discussed this book, The Limits of Growth. It was actually written in the 70s, sponsored by the Club of Rome. But the 80s were a bad time to discuss sustainability. The Soviet Union just collapsed, and everybody looked at the US, and that was kind of the role model. Profit maximization, growth was key, and sustainability was a bit brushed to the side. Fast forward 35 plus years, the awareness in the community at large is quite staggering. And you can slice and dice the community, of course, in different areas. The younger people, for sure, are very, very much aware of what's going on and also more and more willing to do something about it. Of course, I know it's different between developed countries and developing countries and so on and so forth, because there are different considerations and constraints. But I think the awareness in the community at large also rising. So I think the train has left the station. And what I really like about the Inflation Reduction Act, I think it's actually a genius piece of work. And it's a genius piece of work because it got support from a vast amount of Republicans.
Right.
Because ultimately, firstly, the name is quite amazing, Inflation Reduction Act, which of course is a good sell, right? But secondly, it actually creates jobs in the US on the ground. You can criticize this if you zoom out and you have a supranational view. That's a fairly heavy industrial policy piece that they've implemented. So you can be very critical about this from outside of the US, but within the US, it will probably generate jobs. And I find it hard to believe that if there was a Republican president, that they would pull it back if there are actually jobs being created.
100%, Helge. I've been sort of looking at the implementation of this IRA. So Washington, D.C. is basically making states compete. States that have easier regulation hurdles for implementing some of these green projects get the contract. And right now, it's the red states that are actually winning more of the contracts, because the blue states tend to be a little more regulation heavy and a little more, thoughtful into whether they want to take this money and the permits and that sort of stuff. So I was reading an interview of the governor of California, Gavin Newsom. He's expressing frustration that some of the money that should be California bound is going to Texas and other places.
Here we go.
So that competition, and surely that would not change if Washington, D.C. scene were to change. Absolutely. I want to talk about coal momentarily, but before I go there, you talked about the role of banks in general. Can you give us a little flavor about the banks in China? Because without China's progress, we're not going to be able to make any meaningful change on green transition given their size and scale and industrial footprint. How is blended finance, climate change finance, and banks, all working out in China?
Yeah, I think when we talk about the banks in China, they're of course the big ones are all state-owned. I think we actually need to talk about what's happening on government level because this is really definitely very interconnected. And when I talk to people outside of Asia, my maybe slightly naive or superficial comment is, don't worry too much about China. I actually believe if you look back at history, if the Communist Party says they will deliver something, they typically deliver it. So my feeling actually is that China is very strategic in the way it approaches sustainability. Yes, there's still a lot of coal. Yes, they might even add a few coal power plants, but they're investing so heavily in renewable energy. Last year, they increased renewable energy generation by 26%. And this additional generation was roughly half of the world's addition in that area. The Chinese are very smart around electric vehicles, the entire value chain around this. And I could go on and could go on. So I think they're very strategic. I think they also see it as a very important domestic policy tool. So I wouldn't be too concerned about China, as superficial as this might sound. And the banks will simply be there also to facilitate that. Do we see Chinese banks as vocal as maybe European banks or also ourselves? For example, DBS, we have one of the most comprehensive and ambitious decarbonization targets for our lending and financing activities. Yeah, we have those targets by 2030, all of which are science-based, very, very detailed how we're going to do this. Not many banks in China are even remotely on these types of levels, but I would still claim it's all interconnected and ultimately they will deliver what the government is saying they're going to do. And I have great confidence actually that they're going to deliver.
So Helge, I also think that in the case of China, they are so pragmatic in terms of what is needed to grow. And the fact that they have a huge debt burden, they have a dysfunctional property sector, and the banking system is not the soundest either, that a ready-made engine of growth is climate transition.
Yeah.
So whether it is redoing their urban grid or the EV ecosystem that you talked about, or renewable energy generation, whether it's wind or nuclear or solar, it's like if they want to grow at 4 or 5%, that's the only viable area that they'll have left. So there's a convergence of interest and what is right for the world. So yeah, I think I share your perspective on China very much. Helge, recently, the last 2 months to be precise, every Friday you and I met virtually, sometimes in person, and we talked about coal and banks' roles in it, and we wrote a paper. So share with our audience what we wrote about and what are the bottom lines in that paper.
First and foremost, I'm so happy that you now know how a sustainability professional feels. Because you have ups and you have downs.
I went through that.
Sometimes you read about hard facts and data and you really get a bit bogged down and think, oh my God, is this even possible? But then you also look at acceleration of efforts or some positive news and it lifts you up again. But it's literally a cycle, isn't it, that we had in those couple of weeks.
Absolutely.
So why did we write about coal? At the very start of our conversation, I talked about the 400 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions we have left until we hit the 1.5 C temperature limit. Now, if we leave coal untouched, and right now we have around 5,000 operational coal power plants in Asia Pacific, 86% of which measured by capacity are in China and in India, and then we have other countries like Indonesia also fairly significant. So if we leave them untouched, then 2/3 of our carbon budget will be exhausted just by the coal power plants. So we haven't yet talked about the mobility sector. We haven't yet talked about production of steel and cement and all those types of things. 2/3 gone just because of the coal power plants. So that's not even your entire energy system. It's one portion within the energy system. So if you invest a lot in clean tech, and we have to do this, it's mission critical, you're not going to meet the Paris goals. And the Paris goals are, just as a reminder, to keep temperature rises to well below 2 degrees Celsius. So what we wrote about ultimately is a bit why do we have to do this? And how are we gonna do this? And phasing out coal is unbelievably complex on at least 3 levels. The first one is, how do we assess a certain opportunity? For example, there are risks like leakage. If we phase out a coal power plant in northern Sumatra, what prevents the government from building a new one in eastern Java? Or I could name any other country for that matter. Or a company that operates a coal power plant agrees to phasing out a coal power plant in one country, but builds a new one in another country. So there are all sorts of what we call leakage risks. So how do we assess a certain opportunity? What are the commitments on country level, on company level? How do we assess a specific asset, the specific coal power plant? Is it worth our while? How can we really do it? So it's really, really, really complex. So let's assume we've done all of this. We have a great project. Then the next one is, well, we can't just shut down coal, can we? So if we are really, really successful in phasing out fossil fuels, but at the same time we're not rebuilding renewable energy, then people don't have access to affordable energy. And earlier I talked about 17 UN SDGs. One is we need to have access to affordable, clean energy. So you need to do this right away. But that's not always easy. So a coal power plant might be in a geographical location where there is no wind or solar potential. So how do you deal with these situations? There are solutions, but I'm just saying it is something to be looked after. And the third one is there are also other social dimensions, right? I think you very nicely wrote about the implications on jobs and the entire ecosystem that is built around coal power plants in various countries. Entire communities depend on that coal power plant. So if you shut it down, many, many people will lose the jobs. Kids might not be able to go to school anymore because the parents lost the job. So how do we deal with that? So all of this, I think, can be solved, but it's really, really complex. And that's ultimately what we wrote about.
You also were adamant that we include something that you alluded to earlier, the intergenerational aspect. Why is it that critical in the context of coal? Is it because we are sort of fixated on the potential job losses and we're not thinking about the dividend that can come from many, many generations of clean air?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think very often when we talk about interconnectedness or dilemmas, we have a very static approach. So you take action A, let's say you shut down a coal power plant, and the implication is B, for example, certain people lose the job. But if you think about dynamically over a longer period of time, the implications on health by air pollution, water stress, the carbon emissions, and so on and so forth on future generations, the costs are immense. So if you were to take them into account and ultimately calculate the net present value today, then actually you see that taking action today is becoming ever more convincing. So we talked a little bit about this intergenerational fairness, which, as I mentioned earlier, is not a stronghold for human beings generally. Right. We've always struggled a little bit with that.
Right. I want to ask you one technical question. A bank has given loans to a coal company. The coal company's plant is actually not that old. It's only 4 or 5 years old. And it has like a 10-year amortization, depreciation schedule for that asset. So now if we want to target some sort of a 2030 net zero emission, we probably need to phase that coal plant out earlier. So who's going to be left catching that bill? The bank doesn't want to lose its investment, and the asset owner doesn't want to lose their investment either.
That's a very important question, of course, because the way we approached it in this paper that we recently published under the umbrella of GFANZ. So again, GFANZ is this collection of financial institutions globally, and together with HSBC, we led a work stream on how should we do this, and our paper was complementary to that consultation paper that we published, right? And one key consideration was financial viability. Like, how do we structure this in a way that we incentivize everyone to do the right thing? Because it's really hard to negotiate, for example, haircuts or things like this. But here, one critical element indeed is this blended finance structure. So if I simplify this a little bit, we need a new pool of capital, and this new pool of capital has a lower return requirement than the existing pool of capital that financed the existing coal power plant. So this differential in these two allows you to actually shut it down earlier. You are satisfied with less future cash flows arising out of power purchase agreements. But in order to do this new package, you then need different layers of capital. You need potentially public money or multilateral development banks. Like, for example, the Asian Development Bank is very, very active in this space. And then one really interesting layer of capital is philanthropic capital. So there are actually big global philanthropies foundations in the world that actually support these types of financings. And then if you merge it all together, you can create these lower return requirements and actually make it work. One other option is a highly contentious topic, but we think worthwhile looking at, the generation of carbon credits that might arise out of this action. The action is I phase out coal. Yeah, so there's not going to be more greenhouse gas emissions because I shut the coal power plant actually down. We can translate this, and it needs to be transparent, it needs to be credible, and all these types of things. But we can create a methodology based on which we say, okay, we saved, quotation mark, this volume of greenhouse gas emissions because we shut down early. We allow carbon credits to be generated. You can sell them in the market and actually generate additional revenue. So that could be a very interesting construct as well. And given the contentious nature of carbon credits, we just need to make sure it's the right methodology, it's credible, and everyone really is very clear on how we can do this. But that's roughly the idea.
Absolutely fascinating. That sounds really, really cool. Finally, Helge, I want to talk a little bit about our backyard, Singapore. You talk to government officials, you talk to your peers in the banking and financial industry, and also, I believe, sometimes you meet with students and young Singaporeans and hear about their vision for a green Singapore. What's your sense of this society and this government's journey toward a green transition?
Yeah, absolutely. So Singapore has actually been on a very nice journey when it comes to sustainability. If we go a little bit back in time, the government just a little while ago said we want to be net zero sometime in the second half of the century. Then they accelerated it and said we want to be net zero by or around 2050. And then they accelerated it further and say, no, 2050, we're going to be net zero. So from government point of view, there's a huge focus and an acceleration of targets and so on and so forth. So that's actually very, very promising. We're also blessed in Singapore by having extremely smart regulators. I think the MAS, hands down, is probably the best financial regulator I could think of. Very strategic, always thinking in ecosystems. How can we bring everybody together? What are the future solutions? How we address our problem statements? That is quite amazing. Also in the society at large, I mentioned before I stepped in here that I had the honor and pleasure recently with a minister to be on stage, and we were grilled by a couple of hundred of young people that ultimately questioned, are we doing enough? And they were really pushing very, very hard. So I can see, especially in the younger part of society, there's definitely growing awareness. So it's all sounds very positive, right? But let's be also honest, we don't really have an excuse. Singapore is a very rich country because of an amazing, amazing economic success story ever since it was founded in 1965. Probably an economic success story that is unmatched in the world, to be very honest, built on extremely smart people doing this extremely well. And we have very good education, right? So we have a lot of capital, we have really a lot of smart people, so we really got to do it. If Singapore can't accomplish that, then I would be very pessimistic about the world. But I'm optimistic that Singapore will actually further advance and also act upon its targets.
Well, on that somewhat optimistic note, Helge Muenkel, thank you so much for your time and insights.
Thanks a lot, Temur. Great for having me.
Great chat. Thanks to our listeners as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge at Splice Studios. Daisy Sharma and Violet Lee provided additional assistance. All 103 episodes of Kopi Time are available on YouTube, as well as on all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our all research publications and webinars are concerned, you can find them by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.